sure to subscribe. And last week's panel was released this morning as per schedule. For those who missed it also, last weekend, Sunday Boston Globe's Ideas section ran a piece on Innovation Will Help Us Rebuild, which was a series of short essays based on the conference's opening keynote. So really exciting, gotten a lot of good feedback on that. If you haven't seen it yet, please check it out. It's a really nice sort of redux of that hour-long conversation that you could probably read in about 10 minutes. Finally, let's turn to today. So Paul Grogan, as many of you know, has been president and CEO of the Boston Foundation since 2001. He recently announced his retirement, and we really thought, and this was long before the reformulation of the conference, that it would be great to hear him reflect on his long history in civic life in Boston, right? If we go back before that 2001 date, he's filled many, many roles here locally, been a real leader in the community back to the White and Flynn administrations. And for those of you who are not Boston history buffs, those were mayors back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so he's really been in the thick of things for a very long time. And we thought it would be great to have a conversation with him about where we've been and where we're going. And it turned out to be almost perfectly, not in a great sense, but perfectly timed, that given this trenchant moment with the pandemic, that to have this conversation now would be really deeply insightful and valuable to the community. In order to make it a conversation, though, because that's really what we aim for here, and especially as we think about both the future, but the conference's theme of co-creation and collaboration across sectors, we sought to invite respondents to chat with Paul about this theme from the public sector, the nonprofit sector, and as per Bari's expertise, the academic sector. So with that, we have three respondents and a moderator who's going to lead us through. Our respondents are Councillor Michelle Wu of the Boston City Council. She was originally elected to the City Council in 2013 when she became the first Asian American woman on the council. And in 2016, she became the first woman of color to be council president. Second, we have Tanisha Sullivan, who is an attorney in the life sciences, who has spent her career fighting for economic justice, civil rights, and equity more broadly. And she is also the president of the Boston chapter of the NAACP, a role that she has filled since 2016. Catherine Lusk of Boston University's Initiative on Cities. She is a very close partner of Bari and has been for years. She's co-director of the initiative. And she's had a couple different pieces of her career, including some time in the private sector, but she also spent time at City Hall, where she developed and helped lead a number of initiatives that are still going there, including City Hall to Go. And she's now a real leader, both locally and nationally, in thinking about how to connect academia and policymakers, and has taken a real leadership role with the annual survey of mayors through the Initiative on Cities. And then last, leading us through this and having bringing these great people together to have this conversation is Tiziana Deering. You probably know her as the host of Radio Boston. She will be interviewing Paul and kind of bringing everyone together in the conversation. And she also has a great cross-sector background as well, which makes her kind of the unique person to drive this conversation forward. She was a professor of social work at Boston College before joining Radio Boston. She was also before that the first woman president of Catholic Charities, so has a deep knowledge of both Boston and the multiple sectors and institutions that make Boston what it is. So with that, I'm going to step down and I'm going to turn it over to Tiziana to lead us forward.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. And I think it'd be good for me to just give our participants a sense of how this next hour is going to go. I'm going to interview Paul, and we're going to listen to his sort of history of Boston for around 15 minutes. Then I'm going to turn to our three respondents and invite each of them to begin by spending 2 to 3 minutes just immediately reflecting on what they heard. From that, we'll move into a panel discussion that will last about a half an hour. And I'll be occasionally looking to my left where my other screen is, because there's a team that's capturing your thoughts and questions and pulling forward themes that we will then incorporate into our panel discussion. So that just lets you know how to expect to spend the next hour, and we'll take it from there. So Paul, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Tiziana. I have both old friends and new friends on this panel today. It's really terrific to be here.
It's great to have you. So, I thought I would start, Paul, over these last few weeks on Radio Boston. One of the things that I've found in talking to guests is big moments in life, and certainly we're in one, often call us to recall a piece of history that seems particularly important, or we find ourselves reflecting on something else that reminds us of where we are. And I guess I kind of wanted to start by asking you, in the moment we're in now, is there a moment in Boston's history that it evokes for you, or that you seem to particularly find yourself going back to in your mind?
Yes, and I'm glad to be asked the question. It was interesting to think about what the answer should be. But I guess what I'll say is it was in 1978. I was a very junior member of Kevin White's staff, the mayor at the time. Things were very tough in this city in the 70s in a great many respects, and one of them was very tense race relations. Obviously, desegregation was several years underway, lots of tension, ill feeling in the city. And one of the ways that manifested itself was sort of a contest for who owned Carson Beach, a beach on the border of South Boston and Roxbury. And there had been this kind of domination of the beach for years by whites. So they didn't put up a sign that said whites only, but it might as well have been. Some real tensions developed out there, which got into almost riot territory, and there was some violence, and it was a very, very tense week or so before the things were dialed back. And the reason it's important to me is that Kevin White said, "I need to have somebody on the scene for me, and I want you to do it. Get out there." I've felt ill prepared for a number of things in my life that I've been asked to do, but this was really one of them. But it turned out to just be an incredible experience participating in the negotiations with the community, with the police, and we came to a pretty good resolution. And if you go out to Carson Beach today, you will see lots of people, including lots of Black and brown people, looking perfectly at home in what is, of course, a wonderful part of the city from a physical standpoint. And I think that equipped me with some personal maturity, but also an understanding of just how complicated and deep these issues were. And I think I made a resolution to try to work on those issues going forward wherever I found myself.
What's the toolkit you have to bring with you if you're going to have the fortitude to engage in the complicated and deep issues of our city?
I think I've come to believe one of the most important things is empathy. And we were really lacking that as a city for many, many years. But I actually now think we do reasonably well, and we're getting better. And just listening. A lot of times, that's all people want is to be heard. And so in a situation like that, we were able to diffuse the tensions by people feeling I might not have gotten everything I want, but I've been heard.
When in Boston's history has it been hardest for you to listen?
To live here?
No, to listen.
Well, I think that, I got to be a chief executive at first with the city at a fairly young age. I was, I think, 27 when I was asked to run what was then the Community Schools Program, now the Center for Children and Families for the city. And, you get, as a young person, suddenly elevated. It can go to your head, and I think it did on any number of occasions. But I had a brief conversation after this appointment was made with Kevin White, and I thanked him profusely for the opportunity. And he said, "Paul, don't thank me. Now you can be shot." I've never forgotten that.
Let's take a nice round number. Let's pick 1970 as the year. And let's look from 1970 to right now. And I'm going to ask you an unfair question because it's too hard, but I'm going to ask you anyway. What is the story of Boston from 1970 to today?
Well, I think the story of Boston ends, at least if we're ending now, on an extremely positive note relative to where we were. And it's hard for young people and people who've only experienced Boston as this incredibly vital place to realize how damaged Boston was back in 1970. There was a pervasive pessimism about the future of the city. We were hemorrhaging jobs and people to the suburbs. Boston lost nearly a third of its population. Real estate that is now very pricey in the city was pockmarked with abandoned houses, weed-filled empty lots, carpets of glass on the streets. And we participated fully in the urban crisis of World War II. And it seemed like it was going to go on forever. And people talked, maybe just like they're talking now about certain things we may not need anymore. There was this conversation, we don't need cities anymore, really, with transportation so cheap, the traditional rationale for gathering large numbers of people doesn't exist anymore. Well, Kevin White was very defiant that was not going to be the story. And part of what happened during that period, which he began, was a fierce, defiant optimism about the city. And there wasn't a lot to support optimism at that point. We've mentioned race relations still very, very tense. So Boston, was a basket case. I compare it to Detroit. When I was growing up in the 60s, Detroit was the wealthiest city in America on a per capita basis. And at about that same time, Boston was an economic basket case. Now, look what's happened. There's been this incredible reversal. Yes, a remarkable renaissance has occurred, and it's been generated by a combination of good fortune and just historical accident and smart and good things that were done by community people, by mayors, by elected officials like the ones you have on the panel. So it's a really interesting to reflect on the role of luck versus effort. Luck, or historical accident, of course, is what landed 7 research universities in the Boston area and 60-some colleges at a point when higher education was really becoming the ticket, and you needed to have that post-secondary degree. Well, Boston has the metropolitan area has, I think, the highest rate of people in the workforce with a bachelor's degree of any other city. But the research university was really we had these universities for a long time. They were not able to prevent Boston's decline. But what happened is the world economy changed and, in effect, repriced the assets we had in abundance, which are in these research universities. And you see what's happened. It has really driven incredible development. Another piece of the contribution, though, came, again, kind of accidentally in the cleanup of the Boston Harbor. The quest to clean up what was the filthiest harbor in North America was an environmental effort led by Conservation Law Foundation, Save the Harbor, Save the Bay, and others. It was not done by elected officials. The nonprofits, in effect, including with litigation that the Boston Foundation funded, got the federal courts to act and to mandate the cleanup of Boston Harbor. Well, it may be an environmental success story. We now have the cleanest beaches of any city in America. But the economic development impact has been huge, even though there was no one sitting there saying, boy, we need that harbor for economic development. It just happened after the harbor got cleaned up. In terms of what the city has done, I think there's some important dimensions that frequently don't get talked about. One is that Boston has been relatively free of municipal corruption, and that there are so many cities that have had their renaissances undermined by having an environment in which there's still significant political corruption. And we cleaned that up, and we have not had really a mayoral, maybe not everybody would disagree with me about this, but I don't think we've had significant mayoral corruption since the 1940s, really. Another is what's happened to crime. And this is a very important story, obviously, in terms of the Black community with the formation of the Black Ministerial Alliance, the 10-point coalition, and the drive to reduce horrific youth violence that was going on in the city in the 90s. And that partnership was incredibly effective in transforming the relationships, I think, between most of the Black community and the police and the city. And that partnership has continued to this day. And while we read about city after city where there's no trust, there's no connection, it really makes you think about how fortunate we are. And it's an asset that has to be restocked all the time. You can't just be complacent about it, but it is really notable. So I think there have been this interesting combination of things that happened to us and things that we did that have landed us, relatively speaking, in a very fortunate place. Unfortunately, the Renaissance is being accompanied by byproducts that are causing new kinds of problems. Obviously, the tremendous run-up in costs, the giant gulf between incomes, the housing crisis, the transportation crisis. One of the things that's so difficult about solving these problems is they are very much functions of the Renaissance themselves. So how do you keep the Renaissance going and fix those issues, I think, is one of the great challenges of the time. But just to finish this, there's no way I would like to go back. If you're going to have problems, I like the problems we're having today. I would not want to go back to the 70s with the bleak and pessimistic view that was held at that time.
So we've got about 4 minutes left on this part of the discussion, Paul. I think there are two other questions I think I'd like to ask you. You just talked about the inequality, socioeconomic stratification, et cetera, that we're experiencing now as being a byproduct of the Renaissance. What would you say to those who say it's a feature, not a bug, of the way we have developed as a community? Do you understand my question?
Yeah. I think we have to be willing, if we're going to get better, we have to be willing to acknowledge the failures and disappointments. And I think that our collective failure to deliver significantly more economic opportunity and educational attainment, for that matter, to the minority populations of the city, as study after study now has documented, we just haven't done it. And, I think race relations have improved dramatically in the city. There isn't the case you can't go into neighborhoods. It's complete. Speaking as someone who was here in '75, it's a very different and better atmosphere. That's one thing. That's good. But it has not translated into a breakthrough economic opportunity of the kind that we have. And there hasn't been enough there's been a completely inadequate commitment to it. So I think that's a pretty large, disappointment. It's not on the side, and they're just, and of course, it's been reinforced by the whole virus situation, and how we've responded, and the racial disparities there, and the different risks that people are being asked to take, the pathetic compensation that people on the front lines are getting. So I think it's another way in which, like the Globe series a while back, that has really confronted us with, kind of an unassailable indictment of our failure to make adequate progress on this.
I'm glad you brought up education. So I'm actually going to follow that thread for my last question to you rather than the one I was going to ask. You have, in the 15 years that I've known you, you have focused heavily on education. What would you say you and the foundation have gotten most right and most wrong on that front, maybe in the last 15 to 20 years?
Yeah, well, I guess you have to go to the charter schools, which are very controversial, and based on their performance, the Boston Foundation and many others have supported charters, and we achieved in the early part of the decade a doubling of the charter authority, and the charter schools, have now a substantial number of children, and they're doing very, very well. But I think there was a real miscalculation of the politics of this. We can go into it at greater length. And of course, there was a backlash. The Massachusetts Teachers Association ran a very effective campaign to defeat Governor Baker's ballot proposal, which would have significantly expanded charter schools further. So charter schools are now stalled. in terms of further growth. So the question is, okay, how are we going to get the same results without charters? And I have to say that to date, there isn't an answer. There isn't a clear way forward that is being embraced broadly as here's what we need to do on public education, and if we do these things, here's what we'll get. There are good programs, there are plenty of good people, and we're very involved in the BPS in a myriad of ways at the foundation. It can't be, we can't walk away from it, but I don't think I'm saying anything particularly controversial to acknowledge that, you know, people aren't really sure what is going to make a difference. And the national data is not reassuring. I mean, in effect, we're in a situation where virtually no large urban system serving the kinds of kids that Boston serves has shown significant improvement in the last decade or so. So it's a broadly shared disappointment, and we desperately need new thinking on this. And I don't see it at the moment.
On that note, I want to thank you for answering those questions in the interview portion. I think now is probably a good time to move into some of our dialogue. And just to remind everybody about the process here, what I'd like to do next is turn to each of our respondents and give them about 3 minutes each just for initial thoughts. And since we're not all in the same room and I can't use the usual ahem, you know, I'm just going to be like, you got 30 seconds left. And we'll cycle through those and then we'll go into our panel discussion. Tanisha, I wonder if it would be okay if I invite you to respond first.
Sure. Thank you, Tiziana. This is a fantastic, rich discussion, Paul. It's always wonderful to hear your perspective on so many of the issues facing our city today, and also those that we've already kind of conquered. So I deeply appreciate the historical perspective as the daughter and granddaughter of folks who lived in what was then Columbia Point, what is now Harbor Point. Certainly the reference to Carson Beach and how the city addressed the racial tensions that existed in the 70s through the 80s in that particular part of the city, I think is very rich. And I think it's important for anyone, quite frankly, who is interested in helping to move our city forward to understand that history, because there are so many lessons therein. That being said, I mean, certainly today, as you noted, I mean, we are in the midst of this global pandemic and the issues that are being exposed in this moment, from the public health to the economic to the various social issues, are certainly laying bare the very real systemic racial and ethnic inequities that exist across our Commonwealth, across our nation, and of course here in the city. So the question becomes, or the questions are, what do we do about that, and how do we address those issues? I believe, again, as you noted, the what, we have we have a myriad of solutions. As probably one of the most researched cities in the country, we have a myriad of solutions, a myriad of recommendations. The question has always been for us, where is our will to push forward in a way that challenges status quo, that challenges systems and structures that have been in place in some instances for centuries. And so the how is where I want to focus. I do believe that for our city to move forward in a way that is truly inclusive and truly embraces our full potential as a city, we have to have diverse, visionary leadership that is inclusive and is willing to take risk with, at its core, a hope and a belief that we can be better. And so in that, I think it is important for us also to be intentional in our actions, mindful that, as we are trying to move forward, we're just a few years out of, I mean, you mentioned the 70s, Paul. I mean, that was just, 40, 45 years ago, not that long ago. So there is a chance that we could regress if we're not intentional about how we're going to move forward. And, it is truly it is truly our hope that as we do move forward, we are creating a city where all of our residents have the opportunity to fully participate in and benefit from the prosperity that our city has historically experienced within the last probably 10 to 15 years, but that the prosperity that we will hopefully continue to experience.
Thank you, Tanisha. Catherine, do you mind if I ask you to go next?
Sure, it would be my pleasure. So I thought what I wanted to do was sort of complement some of Paul's comments with some of what we hear from other cities across the country. So as Dan mentioned at the beginning, one of the projects that we run is an annual survey. It's actually the Menino Survey of Mayors. Our center at BU was co-founded by Mayor Menino, for those who don't know. And over the last sort of 6-7 years of interviewing mayors, we find that mayors really think about sort of 3 core areas in investing in their community, and sort of the things that promote economic vibrancy and promote health and well-being of their residents. And sort of 3 legs of the stool are physical infrastructure, economic infrastructure, and social infrastructure. Right, the physical environment that we inhabit, the sort of both the economic vitality and vibrancy and mix of the city, as well as the city's finances, all touched on, and the social infrastructure, sort of social cohesion, education, the things that help our people live up to their full potential. I wanted to talk about physical infrastructure to complement the discussion that we've already been having. And I think the point I wanted to make was really over the last sort of 3-4 mayoral administrations, the investment that many players in Boston have been making in neighborhoods. Right, we are a city of neighborhoods. We have this incredible affinity for our neighborhood. We have these incredible array of amenities in our neighborhoods. If you talk about Mayor Flynn, Mayor Menino, Mayor Walsh, they're very neighborhood oriented. And if you talk about the nonprofit sector, the business sector, the philanthropic sector, we have this wealth of resources. That's libraries, that's parks, that's Main Street's business districts. Sort of most acutely now we see with the COVID crisis, this critical need for community health centers. Right, we can actually go and get tested for COVID in our neighborhood. So we have this abundance of riches. We have this strong affinity, sort of this physical infrastructure in the neighborhood base. But one of the things that we haven't really been investing in over the last few years is equitable access, right? The hazards that exist in different neighborhoods to access those amenities are different. If a park requires that I cross 6 lanes of traffic with a stroller or a 2-year-old in hand, that is a hazard. That park is actually not accessible, even if it might be right down the road from my house. So there's 3 sort of hazards that matter in Boston that we haven't really been investing into this point. Those 3 hazards that I see really are cars, vehicles, right? That they pose a threat to our health and well-being. They limit our access to these things. Violence and the disproportionate impact that, as far as we've come, the disproportionate impact that violence has on certain neighborhoods and not others, which limits our access to things. And then the third, which we don't often talk about, is actually heat. And I want to just put heat on the table so that we do have a little bit of a climate conversation, because where I sit in the university, we spend a lot of time worrying about climate impacts and the disproportionate impact that urban heat islands and the sort of increased severity and frequency of heat events are going to have, particularly on our elderly residents. And I'm going to bring it back quickly by saying, Gil Penalosa talks about sort of 880 cities, right? Are we designing our cities in such a way that an 8-year-old feels as safe and confident navigating them everywhere, and an 80-year-old feels as safe and confident navigating them everywhere? And I think that, for me, is sort of, we look to the future of Boston and we think again about that sort of physical infrastructure space, which I want to put on the table. We think about, are we mitigating those hazards? Are we mitigating them in a way that particularly is focused on those communities that have higher prevalency of those hazards?
Last 30 seconds.
And are we creating those spaces where our 8-year-olds and our 80-year-olds actually feel equally confident taking advantages of our beaches, taking advantages of our parks, taking advantages of our libraries, taking advantages of cycling and walking, and getting even access to those health centers that we now so critically need?
Thank you, Catherine. Michelle, I'll turn to you.
Just quickly, speaking about the 8-year-olds, I can't help but reminding us that we are experiencing a rapid reduction in the children's number of children in the city. It's really, they're disappearing, and it'd be interesting to talk about why that's so and what can be done about that.
Thanks, Paul. Go ahead.
Thank you. And it's an incredible honor to be part of this discussion with people who I so admire and respect and who do so much for the city on a daily basis. So I'm really excited to be here. I think responding to Paul's thoughts about kind of the arc of Boston, at least in this more modern history, you think about the scale and the pace of change, and that continues to feel, at least immediately prior to COVID, physically speaking, very fast, right? The cranes that you see everywhere downtown and the projects that we had seen across every neighborhood. And reflecting on that scale and pace of change, much of that was about certain of Boston's major forces getting on the same page, right? Academia and philanthropy and government and business and community. It wasn't all, and not always, on different issues, but we've seen that happen in other cities too, that when these major forces come to some sort of shared vision, shared consensus about what the priority is, that's how you get to the level of intentionality that Tanisha so eloquently talked about establishing that will. Because, frankly, in Boston, even more so than most other places, we have the resources across any metric of how you define resources. It is about how are we going to decide how to invest that and where to put it. So, from government's perspective, from the public sector, I think that requires a certain number of things when it comes to cities. First is a determination that we are in charge of our own destiny, right? That we're not just at the whims of global economic forces and lack a vacuum of leadership from the federal level and issues of home rule authority with the state. That when cities decide to act, and in particular when Boston decides to act, we can directly affect so much. And in fact, we then trigger or create these ripple effects that really drive momentum across issues nationally. I think it also requires from the public sector a willingness to think beyond political cycles, right? Which is hard for people in government, particularly people in elected office, to say what's the right decision, not for the next 2 years or 4 years or when I'm going to have to go get votes again, but for 50 years from now, for 100 years from now. And that's the time frame and scale that some other cities, especially in Europe, are planning out to. And I think that's the mindset that if we want to continue the kind of scale and pace of change for the better and in an equitable way, that's with the mindset we need to get to. Again, because that is sort of structurally difficult for government to do on its own, what needs to happen in my mind is that it's all about shifting power and investing in community decision making, right? So many were left out of this last wave of development and growth, right? The third largest wave, third biggest building boom in Boston's history, dating back to colonial times. Many were left out. And when we don't have that intentionality, we see what happens, for example, in the seaport, right? Incredible development, lots of public dollars invested, and yet, incredible climate vulnerability, traffic,
a real missed opportunity.
Missed opportunity, right? Especially when it comes to equity and who benefited from that wealth. So what's possible if Boston did get all of our forces on the same page for equity, right? Think about food purchasing, and if the city, hospitals, universities all decided to invest in local foods and created markets for Western Mass farmers or urban agriculture. Think about schools. It's only 3,400 kids and 75,000 school-age children, climate, equity, all the issues that Catherine discussed. I think I'll conclude in saying that the tools for how this happens has a direct connection with the data and tech focus of this conference, that it needs to be less about who knows how to apply, right? Who can figure out or is connected to the resources and the information and the mechanisms for getting access. And instead, how do we identify what the scope of need is out in the community with the data that we already have, with the community partnerships we have, start from there, and then define the plan to get there.
Thanks, Michelle. I appreciate that. There's so much in the areas of focus and the responses. I think to start, so what I'd love to do now is I'd like to go free for all, right? So I'm going to throw some questions out. It's a little hard on Zoom, but everybody talks whenever they want to talk. I'll direct if we need it, but I'd love to go free for all now. And so I think the first through line question that I'd like to ask is, we have, as you said, Michelle, we have a wide range of resources, institutions, intellectual capacity, financial resources, public will. And yet we have some serious structural issues that we have not, and I won't say not been able to, I will say just have not addressed. And we balance that with the fragility that I really keyed into, Tanisha, and what you were talking about. You know, at one point you said 45 years isn't that long to a very different kind of history. So how do we find a will we haven't found yet to do collaboration in a way that shores up the progress that we've made so far, shores up those fragile areas of progress, and allows us to get, frankly, anywhere near? It's inconceivable to me, Catherine, in the next, my lifetime, this 8 to 80 city in Boston. I mean, the journey to get there. What do we do to put those pieces in place? I know that's a broad question, but I'm looking for a free for all, so I thought I'd start big.
Well, I have a one-word answer, which is housing. One of the most important things we need to do, which answers a lot of the things we're talking about potentially, is a massive housing campaign for the whole metropolitan area, and to find a way to come down even harder. We're starting to do it on those communities who are preventing a balanced approach to housing by keeping all multifamily and first-time owner homes out. It's just an enormous problem. I don't understand why we haven't acted on it, given how important it is to people. It's a hot issue. Governor Baker has a good bill. It's modest, that he has been unable to get passed because of this exclusionary approach. So, but if we could figure out how to do it, we know how to. We have the most talented for-profit and nonprofit CDCs. Builders. It's really, we have terrific capacity, but we got to take that stopper out of the bottle. And if we don't, it's going to be hard to make progress on a lot of other things.
I'm okay, Tiziana, you're gonna have to direct us because I want to reply to what Paul just said and also answer your question. So
Go.
Cut me off if we need
promise.
to. I think so. On the housing front, I mean, my gut reaction is yes, absolutely. And I was actually just looking at that report that came out from the Boston Indicators Project about families that, I mean, the loss of school-age children in Boston over the last few decades is heartbreaking, right? So the question is, going back to Tanisha's point about intentionality, what is our intention of what kind of city we want to be? And does that include families? I mean, in my mind, you can't have a city with a soul without young people and kids and families able to afford to be here. So housing is certainly the foundation for all of that. At the same time, we cannot have the conversation about housing just in the vacuum of supply, right? We often hear, you know, just build, and we're going to aim for this many thousands of units. But unless you break that down into what does that mean for each neighborhood to have it happen sustainably, and how are you also going to stabilize communities in this transition to where we're at the right point for supply, people are going to get pushed out. People are being pushed out. People have been pushed out. And our residents who are facing displacement and those pressures of gentrification have been told for a long time, you know, this is just the byproduct of the golden goose and growth. And yet in this COVID moment, we are doing things that people always said was impossible, right? We're making it, we're giving some relief and providing a stop to evictions. We're stabilizing people in their homes because we recognize how important that is for everyone else's health to have stable housing for everyone. So I think it has to go hand in hand. The increase.
I think the eviction was very significant that the eviction legislation passed. That was very encouraging.
Catherine, I've seen you nodding a whole bunch there. So let me turn to you. And then Tanisha, I think that's a little bit of a let me in. So I'll go to Catherine and we'll go to Tanisha.
You know, the thing I just wanted to add, I think in response to your question, Tiziana, is one of the things that Dan didn't mention is when I worked for Mayor Menino, I helped to start the Boston Women's Workforce Council to try to make Boston the first city in the country to close the gender wage gap. And I think what I learned through that process is that we have a willing business community. We have a willing institutional community who want to do the right thing, who understand, at least in the case of the wage gap, who understand, you know, this is a talent argument. I have a responsibility and an opportunity to attract and retain talent and pay them fairly. And I think, you know, what I learned through that work and continue to learn is that people don't have a roadmap. They have a sense of, I know the right thing to do, but I actually don't know what the evidence tells me about how to do it. And if you create, in this case, a collaborative governance model like the Green Ribbon, we were sort of modeled on and inspired by the Green Ribbon Commission to create the Boston Women's Workforce Council. But we have these mechanisms. I'm not talking about the community level. That's another critical piece. I'm talking about sort of the big institutional players. But you have this opportunity to sort of bring the big institutional players together to make them co-conspirators and sort of co-investors in whatever the sort of social priorities are of Boston. And I think I learned through that process that not only can you then give them a roadmap and say, here's the interventions you need to be introducing to solve this problem together. But, and I'm not trying to take credit for this at all, but I think when you also do that and you make them co-conspirators and you make them complicit, you create the conditions for legislation to happen because they're already convinced, right? How many decades had people been fighting for pay equity legislation in this state? And it passed after we created the Women's Workforce Council, after AIM got on board, after the chamber got on board, after all the major employers in town got on board saying, we realize now why this matters.
Catherine, I want to get
but I think that when you bring them along and you create this pool of co-conspirators, legislation that is critical to solving any fundamental challenge there's more appetite for it.
I want to get Tanisha in here.
Yeah, I actually think that we're looking at the issue in a way that makes it more challenging to address the systemic and structural inequities that I think that we all on this panel acknowledge exist. And for those who don't believe they exist, we can send you loads and loads of data. I know Luke Schuster is on the line. He can forward that data to you. That being said, I think, looking at how we solve some of these issues in silos, I think is creating more of a challenge. And the reason I say that is because we have yet to define the problem as a collective and agree to what the problem is that we're trying to solve. I would submit that we have two fundamental root causes for why we find ourselves in tackling inequities, whether we're looking at education, housing, climate, public safety, and criminal justice. And those are two very familiar issues for us. One, race, and the reality that here in the city of Boston, although Paul laid out a wonderful kind of description of how we have evolved as a city, we have yet as a city to really address our fundamental issues and challenges as it relates to race, period, not racial justice, not racial inequity, race. And two, here in this city in particular, we have a very real kind of in your face, but we don't want to see it, issue as it relates to not just economic inequality, we need to name it, it's poverty. We've got a lot of families who, we like to dress it up and say working class, we like to dress it up and say low income. The reality is there's such a deep seated poverty in our city for so many of our residents that too is keeping us from being able to really get to the root causes and the systemic issues that manifest themselves in housing crisis, economic crisis, education crisis, public safety et al. So I would suggest that that in order to move forward, we really have to wrestle with the issues of race and poverty that exist in our city.
Paul, let me let you weigh in there for a second.
Oh, I agree completely. I think that in the absence of a lot more advocacy and zeal that needs to be brought to this issue, we're going to keep kind of muddling along. There'll be some good stories. There'll be some things that happen that are good, but the general situation is going to remain the same unless we do things very differently. And to me, what I mean by that is that there just has to be determined and long-term advocacy from the community. And then there needs to be a more deliberate effort to cohere the business community behind an agenda. And I think that could happen. I do think that that many people are embarrassed about the statistics that we see and the message that we just are not getting it done. And we're all I don't want to have another Carson Beach, but I think determined advocacy and impatience is it's got to be part of what gets this thing going again. And let's start with what's going on right now.
I agree.
Okay.
I agree, Paul. I think part of it, there's a responsibility certainly on community and really the residents of the city to help drive this change. But I also think there's a culture there's a culture element of this within the business community that needs to be addressed. I mean, we all know that business leaders expect to identify a problem and have a solution within 24 to 48 hours. Of course, I'm exaggerating. And they want to see real meaningful progress in a very short period of time. The issues of race and poverty are issues that are going to, that we can't solve overnight. And so in many respects, our business community, much needed partners in this work, also has to come to the table understanding that that this is going to be a long-term relationship. Right. And we need to have some agreements on kind of what that relationship is going to look like 3, 5, 20 years down the line. And you mentioned the education issue that so many of us have been involved in because of its importance to our children and our families. That's a perfect example where businesses wanted, we want an answer now. We want those data points, the achievement gap to close tomorrow. Long-term strategy is what is needed there with, of course, short-term benchmarks for progress.
Michelle, I'm seeing a lot of nodding.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think another point I will toss in is that at least just in my relatively short time on the Boston City Council, I have seen the dynamic within the council and sort of the council's relationship to the city change very, very quickly, right? Even shorter than 45 years, just in the last 7 years, we went from a point where when I was running for office in 2013, Ayanna Pressley was the only woman serving on the Boston City Council, the first ever woman of color to be elected to the city council in the city's history. And then just this last cycle, we swore in for the first time a majority city council that was majority women, majority people of color, majority progressive. And it's this incredibly fast changing of the ecosystem that can happen, that is a combination of different faces in government and in positions of leadership across every sector, all of a sudden saying we can approach the goals differently, we can convene differently, that changing what voters and residents expect of government and of every other sector, and then new people emerging and saying, I never saw myself as being in that kind of role before, didn't think that that was the sort of outcome that could come from that body or that group. And now I'm gonna run because no one's telling me not to. And in fact, people are encouraging me. And just thinking about the difference in the campaigns in the first election, when all the questions were, who do you know? Where'd you grow up? Where does your mom live? What school did you go to now,
what parish?
What do you care about? What communities do you represent? What issues are you going to champion? I'm not even sure we knew what neighborhood each of the council candidates represented this or came from this last cycle. And so that kind of shift of what's possible redefines how fast things can happen.
So let's pick up on that. Oh, Catherine, I did see you wanted to make a point. I'll have you make
I don't want to, this is such an important conversation about like electoral representation that I don't want to, but there's a question that I do want to pose to Paul, sort of partially inspired by what Tanisha was saying. So you tell me if you want me to do that now or if you want to focus on electoral representation.
Well, we're not going to be able to stay on any one subject for too long anyway. So if you've got a question, you should ask it.
Okay, so Paul, the question for you, inspired by what Tanisha was saying, I think is part of this sort of my inspiration around making the business community, and I'll actually say the employer community, right? Because BU is not a business, we're an employer though in town, and we make huge investments in the public school system, both directly through schools like the Trotter and through giving tuition-free, attendance at BU to BPS grads. So when I did the Women's Workforce Council work, the other piece of inspiration was the Boston Compact. And the Boston Compact, we created the Boston Women's Compact, and we asked employers to publicly sign a pledge saying, I will do these things, and I will track data over time, and I will make these investments in closing the gender wage gap. And I had to sort of dig back through to say, what was the original sort of contours of the Boston Compact? And so the question I want to ask you is, as Tanisha is talking about bringing the employer community, the business community along, and we're talking about issues of race and poverty and needing to be really intentional about how we solve them, are we getting to a point where something like a renewal, of sort of refresh of the Boston Compact, are we sort of at that moment where we need a new sort of commitment and public commitment on the part of our employers, sort of a renewal of their investment in schools, their investment in poverty alleviation in Boston? And if we are at that point, what does that look like?
Well, I think that's an intriguing thought, and there has been in recent years some reappearance of business involvement. The Massachusetts Competitive Partnership being maybe the most dramatic example, where you've got all these CEOs sitting around the table. They really participate. They really get involved. You also have an example of individuals like Bob Rivers at Eastern Bank, who's just rewriting the book about what a CEO can do, and he's having an effect on people. So we may be edging up to a moment like we did with the Boston Compact. Thank you for mentioning that, years and years ago, and we went through that very public signing process, and the Boston Compact lives today. I mean, what it's done for kids is just astounding. It's making sure the timing is right, but I think that's a possibility. It's becoming a possibility.
I want to go into a lightning round. And we may or may not have time for more after the lightning round, but this is based both on what I've heard and some of the themes I'm seeing in the questions that have come up. So I'm going to ask a two-part question. I'm going to ask you each to kind of go bam with a quick answer on this two-part question. I'm never fair. This is not fair. So the two-part question is, what's one thing we could immediately be doing differently to put residents in the driver's seat on coalitions and agendas? And the second part is, if we did that, what's the most important agenda item right now? And I will start with you, Tanisha, and I'm going to move counterclockwise on my screen from there. Tanisha.
Yeah, I don't think that this is a fair setup here.
I'm sorry.
So this is what I'll say. Look, when I think about issues of civil rights and social justice, I'm always reminded of MLK's guidance around, that the inextricable twin of racial equality is economic equality. And so when I think about our city, I think that there are actually, again, two issues that we need to address: racial inequality and economic inequality. What can we do to have residents more involved? I mean, the answer is to listen to residents. Residents are actively engaged through neighborhood councils and other vehicles, actively engaged in our governance and throughout our community. The challenge is that when residents speak, specifically residents who are from communities of color, residents from immigrant communities, residents from low income and communities that are wrecked with poverty, they're not listened to. And so we really need to do a better job at not just creating spaces for residents to participate, but really creating spaces and holding space for residents to more directly drive decision-making across our city.
Thank you, Tanisha. Michelle, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, I think for me to translate, I was going to say something very similar. The translation of that into how I've been thinking about municipal policy is around planning, that much of what happens in the city, at least from the government side, is driven by the city's dependence on development, and namely large-scale commercial development to fund city revenues. And therefore, we're still using the same development structures from the 1960s, right? The city has not had a comprehensive master planning process that has changed our zoning code. So we have not had an updated zoning code that takes into account all of our city's needs, from climate, transportation, housing, schools, et cetera, since 1965, right? That is the date that the base zoning code dates back to. And so when the way that we keep residents at the table is to actually involve them in the part of the process that matters, setting the rules, and then hold fast to those rules, as opposed to what we have now, which is we're still operating off of old rules that aren't really rules because they don't even make sense. So every project is an exception. Every project is a new negotiation. And that means that those who have political power or wealth or influence are more likely to get their exceptions squashed or whatever they want. And those who are not listened to, as Tanisha said, historically and traditionally and represented in government, are the ones who are always overridden. So I think how do we, and what agenda item can guide that? We think about what does a Green New Deal look like at the municipal level? How do we use the tools of procurement and zoning and democratization to marry our climate needs and our economic needs and our community participation?
Thank you. Catherine, I'll go to you next so that we can give last word to Paul.
Sure, I'll mention, I'm going to mention formal power. I'm going to mention appointed boards and commissions. So Mayor Garcetti, the mayor of LA, when he took office, he actually set a goal to make 50% of appointees to boards and commissions women. And he exceeded it. I think they're about 55% women now based on research. And there's great body of research around appointed boards and commissions, right? Because you have formal access to power, you have formal influence, and then there are also pathways to more power, because many of those roles give folks sort of entree into how government works, which positions them well to then run for office. And so I think one of the really immediate opportunities for Boston is to really think about all of our appointed boards and commissions and say, let's gather rigorous data. There are researchers who've done this, actually even for Boston, and look at race, ethnicity, and gender in those appointed boards, and actually have criteria around how we're making decisions and making conscientious decisions so that we're giving formal pathways into City Hall, into power, and into positions of influence, and ultimately setting up people to run for office.
Thank you. Paul, last word is to you.
Well, first of all, thank you for including me in this. It's been a great morning or early afternoon, and I've gotten a lot out of this, so thank you so much. Let me mention an issue that hasn't been mentioned, which is sort of looking for levers. If we're going to enlist people, how are we going to do that? Through persuasion or through something more fundamental? And what's more fundamental is workforce, and that's something that, particularly when the effects of the virus pass along, we're going to be reacquainted with this huge demographic challenge. We have a declining and aging white population. All the growth that we've had has been supplied by immigrants, but they're not doing very well in aggregate. That demographic question is of great moment to the business community, and it could be a way of enlisting them in a broader effort that included that as an important dimension. So it's looking for that lever. Where is it? Sometimes it's surprising, though. You find yourself pushing on an open door, but you got to keep pushing.
Thank you, Paul. Dan O'Brien, I don't know if I'm supposed to invoke you. I think I am, so I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
All right. Well, thank you, Tiziana, so much for leading us through this conversation. Thank you, Paul, for the deep and really optimistic thoughts about where Boston has come from and where we're headed, and all the great resources, but all the challenges we want to bring those resources to bear on in the coming years. And thank you as well, of course, to Councillor Wu, to Tanisha, and to Catherine for the great insights as your organizations continue to help lead that way. But I love this conversation about a bigger Boston compact, and how do we get everyone at the table, right? More than just the 5 people who are talking right now and the 100 or so people who were in the session, right? How do we really get all voices, and how do we coordinate that effectively? And I thought that was probably, for me, the most inspiring part of this, and something we really aspire to here at BARI. So with that said, thank you again to all the panelists. Thank you to everyone who attended today. Really enjoyed having you. Without you, this doesn't happen. Just a reminder, we are not doing a BARI happy hour this week because it's noon. I mean, I'm not going to stop you. It's Memorial Day weekend, but we are doing a BARI lunch. The link has changed slightly. It is bit.ly/BARI happy. It's been posted in the Q&A, and you will need a password to get in. The password is just BARI, capital B-A-R-I. And I mean, maybe we'll learn the answer to the eternal question: should one eat a pastrami and rye on a Zoom call? I don't know yet, but we might find out. Otherwise, so those who can join us, we look forward to seeing you there. And those who cannot, we look forward to seeing you at the next panel. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Come in.